Hello and welcome to the FatBoss Guide to Fel Lord Zakuun on Mythic in the Hellfire Citadel.
Yes, this is actually a relatively short fight, but there is a lot that you need to know, because even if one person messes up, you are 100% gonna wipe.
Now for this encounter you want to bring 2 tanks, 4 to 5 healers, and you can bring almost any DPS composition you like. Now this fight on Mythic is very similar to Heroics in many ways, mainly that the boss will still switch between phases on a timer and will still enter his last phase at 30%, and he'll still cast all the same abilities from Heroic as well. However, there are a few important changes that you do need to deal with. Now in phase 1, the boss will still spawn the Fissures on a timer, and every time he does spawn them, there'll be 5 at a time. Now every time you soak these patches like you did on Heroic to prevent the crystals from spawning out of them, you will still get the latent energy debuff on those players who are soaking. However, the change that is in place with this debuff is that it no longer has a short duration that eventually will just time out. Instead, it is now permanent. Which means by the end of the fight, after everyone is taking turns soaking all the different fissures, you'll have the entire raid coated with this debuff, which is horrendously bad and you're going to wipe, so you need to remove it. Now the only way that you can remove this debuff on Mythic is by standing on top of the tank and going inside when the boss casts Soul Cleave.
Now Soul Cleave on Mythic does not only send in your tank, but it also sends in up to 4 other people, providing that they are stood within the circle around the tank. Once you're inside and your timer expires and you're released back into the main room, your latent energy debuff will be removed. Now you will however get a new debuff that prevents you from re-soaking any fissures for 2.5 minutes. This means that you cannot have the same people soak fissures for the entire fight. You'll need to set up new rotations of people, and as those new people soak fissures, they'll need to drop their latent energy debuff, which means that you also need to send in different people each time on the Soul Cleave.
So before you even pull the boss, you will need to sit there and organize groups to soak each individual sets of fissures. Now the amount of soaking groups that you'll actually need to set up entirely depends on how strong your DPS is. If you have really high damage, you'll need significantly less groups than if your damage is low, because the fight is going to be shorter. To give you an idea of how many you may want to set up, on our initial kill we had 7 soaking groups, but as our gear has improved and on recent kills we've only had 3 or 4 soaking groups. When setting up your soaking groups, it's important to have the first few groups consisting of classes that can negate the damage from the waves that spawn when the players actually leave the room.
So when the players leave the Shadow Realm, not only will they spawn those waves on the outside just like you had a seed or something, but you'll also spawn an orb on the inside that will pulse waves across the room in the Shadow Realm. Now if you place these orbs in decent locations from the start, ideally on top of each other, it will make the jobs of the later soaking groups inside a hell of a lot easier, as the majority of the waves will be stacked on top of one another and moving in the same direction. It's just like cleaner and more predictable. However, if you do stack on top of each other when you leave, you'll be soaking each other's waves, and if you do not have an immunity up, you'll die immediately, so you need to use deterrences, ice blocks, paladin bubbles, all that kind of good stuff. Classes with massive damage reductions can also do the job, but just nowhere near as well as 4 players with immunities. There isn't a damage reduction in the game strong enough to soak 4 sets of waves, so because of this, you're forced to split into 2 groups rather than 1. In this situation where you have a group inside split into 2, just make sure you're positioned on the edges of the room far from where people will enter from the Soul Cleave. Just try and set up your earlier groups to stack before they leave and you should be good.
So the way that we set up our groups is that the first group we actually split into 2, so we have 2 different groups. They stand on top of each other, none of the waves spawn because they soak it. On the second one we send in our immunity group, which consists of hunters and mages. They all stand directly on top of each other, again no waves come out. On the third group we actually have a group that doesn't consist of any damage reductions or immunities, so in this situation we just send those players towards the back of the room where the boss is stood before you pull, and we just make sure those players aren't on top of each other as they leave. This does mean that a load of waves are going to be sent out. You shouldn't really have any latent players at this point, but if they do, of course, make sure you avoid the waves, and everyone else should be blocking any waves that are going towards your crystals. Now on our 4th soaking group, and all groups afterwards, we don't actually send anyone in with the tank ever again. We just let him go on his own. This does mean that from this point onwards, there are players in the raid outside that will have latent energy, which is kind of a bit dodgy. But play well and you don't get any explosions, it's a non-issue. Just make sure you avoid the waves as a latent player and you'll be absolutely fine. And the main benefit of doing this really is just to increase boss damage because there's less people going inside. A little tip for your Disc Priests and your Holy Paladins: before people actually are hit by the Soul Cleave itself, make sure that you pre-shield them as much as you possibly can, because you don't really want them going in there with low health. Like, it's just really, really dodgy, because when they do eventually come out, sometimes you get rumbling fissures almost at the exact same time, which pulses AoE damage on your raid, and they can almost die as instantly when they come out. So pre-shield them, and they shouldn't die when they come out. Also, another tip for all of your healers is when Befouled comes in, it has a really nasty habit of coming in just before people need to go inside the Soul Cleave. So if there's any players that are assigned to use the Soul Cleave but have Befouled, instantly clear them. Focus them first before healing any other Befouled targets, just so they can go in without killing anyone.
Now when it comes down to soaking fissures, what you want to do is leave any patches that spawn near the entrance of the room. You'll be putting seeds on the opposite side of the room in phase 2, so it just makes it so the pillars are as far away from the seeds as possible. Occasionally, if we get multiple fissures spawn in decent locations, we'll actually allow multiple crystals to spawn rather than just one. This does mean that less people need to soak them and then go inside, but it does mean there will be more AoE damage going out on the raid long term. As long as you don't do it for every single set of fissures, your healers should be able to manage. The damage is very predictable from the crystals, and it only really becomes an issue in phase 2. Now, as you may have noticed, we have our entire raid stacked in phase 1 instead of spread like you would normally do on Heroic. If you have a single player stand in between the range camp and the boss, he can soak the entire cavitation and therefore nobody needs to move. That said, not every class can do it. You can use high damage reductions or immunities, which is kind of wasted because you kind of want to use them in the Shadow Realm to cheese, or you can simply just have a mage use Evidence. It'll be up for every single cavitation, and although his DPS will go down, the raid DPS overall will go up because you have to move less. This also helps with healing because everyone is taking a lot of pulsing AoE throughout the entire fight, and stacking up just makes healing a hell of a lot easier. You also want to make sure that you do have backup players to cover this role, just in case your assigned mage is either inside the Shadow Realm or he's dead or something. We use hunters most of the time, using deterrence or maybe even a spare mage if they're free.
Now, once you've nailed down phase 1 and you manage to get in phase 2, you will notice, of course, that the tank damage goes up, just like it does on Heroic. Make sure you're stacked on top of each other and start to chain your cooldowns for the next 30 seconds or so, and the raid will begin to start taking more AoE damage. So at this point, healers, you want to start chaining your healing cooldowns, but don't go too crazy. Do keep in mind that it's likely you'll see phase 2 twice on your first kill, and the phases are 2 minutes or so apart, which means you do need to spread your cooldowns just to cover both phases. But the most important thing in this phase is, of course, the seeds. Now, 5 players will get the seeds, and they work the exact same way as that they do on Heroic. The debuff will time out, and you'll just send out waves in 8 directions. If you simply run out the raid and just place them randomly anywhere, which is probably what you did on Heroic, it's unlikely that you'll be able to do it cleanly, and you'll just end up with like random deaths, with seed targets stacking on top of each other, and it'll just be a fucking mess. The way that you should do it, the cleanest possible way to do it, is that we have our 5 affected players run to set locations in the room. Now, we set up 5 world markers towards the back of the room, and they're spaced equally apart and are in the straightest line possible. When the seeds come in, your boss mod, whichever you're using, so DBM or Bigwigs or even Exhaustus raid tools, will mark the affected players, and we have those players run to the world marker that is the same as their raid icon. Now, this can be difficult to do because it's not always easy to see exactly what raid icon is on top of you, but we do have a weak aura that will help you out with this. It'll just give you a massive sign that says you have this mark on your head. You can find a link to that string in the video description.
Now, before setting up your world markers, check to see what raid icon players are getting in your boss mod, and make sure you have the same world markers as the seed debuff players are getting. So when the seeds come in, we use a roar and the players run to their locations and stand still. The moment the seeds blow up, all seed players will be sending a single wave directly down the line, where their fellow seed players are stood. Now, to prevent being hit by this, simply move forward a few steps after you've exploded. Move too little and you'll be hit by the one coming from the side, but if you move too far, you'll get hit by another wave moving in like a diagonal direction. As soon as you've dodged the initial wave from your other seeded friends, move back to the raid and be ready for the next one. Now, as for the non-seeded players, because everyone with seeds is stood in the exact same positions every single pool, and the waves always go out in the exact same 8 directions, it is extremely easy to predict where the waves are going. This pattern also creates plenty of safe spots in the room, mainly towards the entrance of the room. Now, these areas will never have waves pass through them, providing that the people with seeds stands in the correct places. Do note that this might change on a weekly basis unless you somehow manage to put the world markers in the exact same pixel by pixel location every time. However, it is easy to see where they're going, regardless if it's exactly the same as last time or not.
Now these safe spots earlier in the fight are slightly irrelevant, but in later phase 2s or the last phase where people will have latent energy, these spots are incredibly useful as they should prevent anyone from accidentally exploding because they got hit by a wave without the need for them to run around like a headless chicken. However, you can't just have the entire raid in the safe spot the entire time because you do need to soak some of these waves because they're going to hit the crystals. You want to assign your melee and tanks to cover the left hand side of the room, have your range to cover the middle and on the right hand side of the room. If your class is weak at soaking because you have, I don't know, say little damage reductions or really bad mobility, it's pointless for you to soak. You do not need your entire raid to soak, nor do you need to even soak every single wave. Just have your hunters, your warlocks, your mages, your rogues, your death knights, your tanks, anyone that has a decent damage reduction, go out and soak them and just make sure none of them hit the crystals. And for everyone who's not soaking, so you know, your latent targets or your players like what are playing shit classes, make sure that they just stand in a safe spot.
Now once you've got your phase 2 down and you're starting to look at getting into the last phase, if you transition with only a single tank, you can easily have him die, as the boss damage in the last phase is pretty brutal. But apart from having both tanks in the main encounter area, it doesn't really matter when you transition the boss, as there was a couple of problems with multiple fissures spawning all at the same time and overwriting one another, and it fucked everything up. That's all kind of been patched out now, so just feel free to transition whenever the fuck you like.
Now in this last phase, the first set of fissures that spawn, you'll probably want to soak, but all fissures after this point, you should be able to ignore. You should be able to kill the boss before all 5 crystals spawn. If you do need to soak them because all the crystals did spawn because of your lack of DPS, then fine, you don't really have any other option. But ultimately, the hardest part of this phase is the seeds. You'll have befouled and seeds almost within 10 seconds of each other, and these befouled targets need to be cleared up as soon as possible, otherwise they're going to have a really difficult job dodging all the waves, because of course they can't really stand in the safe spots, because there's like passive AoE healing going out, and if they explode on the raid with a befouled,
yeah, you'll die.
It's a wipe. So you need to make sure that those targets get healed up instantly, and then when the seeds come in, those players just need to move out as soon as they possibly can. Deal with the seeds just like you did in phase 2, and then shortly after that, you'll then get a cavitation. And from this point onwards, if your entire raid managed to survive like this 30-second period, not really much can go wrong at this point. It's very likely that the boss should die. You should be saving all of your cooldowns for this last phase. Save your second pot, save your 3 minutes, save your rings, save your bloodlust, save everything. You want to kill the boss before the second set of seeds. And ultimately, if you do get the second set of seeds because you don't have enough damage, just deal with them like you have with every other set of seeds.
Let's be real though, you'll probably panic and it will all go horribly wrong,
yeah,
and one person will survive, but you'll still kill it. So it'll be fine.
But I mean, towards this end point of the fight, of course, on those second set of seeds, you are going to have even more players with latent.
Yeah.
So even more things can go wrong. And even if it's just a single player who gets hit by those seeds, the latent explosion does a ridiculous amount of damage to the raid. It's well over half people's health. And of course, all this AoE pulsing damage is coming in as well. It's very nasty. If you don't explode, nothing can go wrong, exactly, providing all the other waves are soaked from hitting the crystals. So there's a lot of shit going on, but yeah, don't get the second set of seeds, deal with the first set of seeds, and the boss should die.
So thank you very much for watching, guys. If this guide did help you out, then make sure you leave us a like. It helps us out a lot. And of course, we'll see you in the next video.
Thanks for watching.